Chapter 1. The Gilded Cage. The dress was a lie. A beautiful, suffocating lie stitched from crimson silk and the jagged edges of her father's ambition. Selene stood in a shadowed alcove, trying to melt into the stone as the great hall of the Silver Moon Pack pulsed with life. It felt like a living thing, its laughter a booming heartbeat and the clinking of glasses a glittering sigh. The silk, a shade too bright and a size too small, dug into the soft flesh of her waist, a constant pinching reminder that she did not belong. She was a square stone shoved into a round hole, meant for a different world entirely. Her immediate goal was simple: become invisible. Just for a few hours. Following that initial wave of anxiety, a deeper exhaustion settled into her bones. This banquet, held to celebrate the vernal equinox, was meant to be a symbol of pack unity. For Selene, it was an annual performance of pretending she didn't hear the whispers that followed her like stray dogs. She tugged at the constricting bodice, the movement small and useless. Her gaze drifted over the throng of bodies, warriors with shoulders as broad as oak trees, she-wolves in gowns that shimmered like captured moonlight. They moved with a fluid grace she could only dream of, their confidence a language she'd never learned to speak. Is this what it feels like to be whole? To fit inside your own skin without a fight? Her father, Alpha Marcus, stood near the roaring hearth, his back to her as he always was. He was a mountain of a man, all power and presence, but the warmth of his fire never seemed to reach her. Suddenly, a pair of she-wolves, Lyra and Cassia, glided past. Their laughter was sharp, like breaking glass. "Did you see the Alpha's daughter?" Lyra murmured, her voice a poisoned dart. "He's trying to dress her up for the visiting Alpha, but you can't wrap a pig in silk and call it a princess." Cassia snickered, a high, piercing sound. Poor Kael. Imagine being shackled to that. He'd break her. The words struck Selene with physical force, stealing the air from her lungs. A hot flush crawled up her neck, painting her skin with a shame so profound it felt like a second, tighter dress. She pressed herself harder against the cold stone, wishing it would swallow her whole. Her eyes darted to her father, a silent plea. He must have heard. He heard everything, but his expression didn't flicker. He simply took a deep drink from his silver goblet, his indifference a far deeper wound than any insult. Because their cruelty was expected, but his silence was a confirmation. It told her they were right. From across the hall, a stillness caught her eye, a pocket of calm in the swirling chaos. Seated at the head table, next to her father's empty seat, was Alpha Kael of the formidable Shadowclaw pack. He wasn't laughing or drinking. He was watching her. Not with the pity or disgust she was so used to, but with an unnerving predatory intensity. His eyes, the color of molten gold, seemed to strip away the crimson silk, the false smiles, and the carefully constructed walls around her heart. They saw the trembling girl hiding in the alcove. The air grew thick, heavy, and a strange shiver traced a path down her spine. He knew. Somehow, that stranger, that cold and brutal Alpha from the mountains, knew she was breaking. The weight of his stare was a physical pressure, a brand against her skin. It was different from the other's casual cruelty. His was focused, deliberate, and she couldn't figure out why. He should be looking at the graceful she-wolves who danced and preened for his attention, not the lump of shame hiding in the shadows. A low growl rumbled in the room, so deep it vibrated through the stone floor. It came from him. His golden eyes narrowed, not at her, but at the two she-wolves now preening by the fire. A flicker of... what? Protection? It was impossible. No one had ever defended her. His gaze then returned to her, and this time, it held a question she couldn't decipher, a dark promise that terrified her more than any insult. This single silent exchange shifted the axis of her world, introducing a terrifying new element into her carefully managed misery. Chapter 2. A Scent of Change. Just as Selene felt the last of her composure begin to crumble, a familiar warmth appeared at her side. "There you are," a soft voice chided. "Hiding again, Selene?" You'll miss all the fun. Alara, her only true friend, slipped an arm through hers, her presence a small, sturdy shield against the onslaught. Alara was everything Selene wasn't. Petite, fiery, and utterly fearless. Her silver hair was braided with wildflowers, and her smile could disarm the fiercest warrior. She squeezed Selene's arm gently, her eyes full of a fierce, unwavering belief that Selene had never understood. How could one person look at her and see something worth loving? Building on that quiet moment of comfort, Alara pulled her further into the alcove, away from prying eyes. "Don't listen to those vipers," she whispered, her voice laced with steel. "They're just jealous because they have the depth of a puddle. You have oceans inside you. You just need to learn how to let the tides roar." Selena offered a watery, unconvinced smile. "It's fine, Alara. I'm used to it." "That's the problem," Alara insisted, her grip tightening. "You shouldn't be. You are the daughter of an alpha. You have a strength in you that you refuse to see. Maybe fate has something bigger planned for you than just this." "Fate doesn't care about girls like me," Selene mumbled, looking down at the silk that strained at her seams. "It prefers girls like them, girls who are easy to look at." "You think strength is about being easy to look at?" Alara's question was sharp. "Strength is about surviving nights like this. It's about getting up every morning in a world that tells you to stay down. Your heart is the strongest thing in this entire room, and one day, the right person is going to see that." It was a pretty thought, a fairy tale she'd stopped believing in long ago. Yet, as Alara spoke, a strange shift occurred in the atmosphere of the Great Hall. It started as a subtle vibration, a thrum of energy that made the hairs on Selene's arms stand on end. Then came the scent. It wasn't the familiar smell of roasted meat, pine, or wolf musk. This was something else entirely, something wild and primal. It smelled of storm-ravaged forests, of dark earth and crackling ozone, of something ancient and powerful awakening from a long slumber. It was a scent that bypassed her nose and struck a chord deep within her soul, a note that resonated with a part of herself she didn't know existed. It was terrifying, it was magnificent, and it was pulling her, drawing her attention back to one person, Alpha Kael. He had risen to his feet, his powerful frame taut with a sudden bone-deep tension. His golden eyes scanned the room, no longer focused on her, but searching, hunting. Other powerful wolves, the pack elders, the lead warriors, were stirring too, their heads lifting, their nostrils flaring. They could smell it. They could all feel it. But the scent seemed to be a symphony composed just for her. It whispered of moonlit chases, of fierce loyalty, of a bond forged in fire and shadow. It was a call, and her very blood seemed to hum in response, a dizzying, frightening vibration that promised to shatter her world. She clutched Alara's arm, her knuckles white. "What is that? What's happening?" Before Alara could answer, the scent intensified, zeroing in on her like a hawk diving for its prey. It wrapped around her, sinking into her skin, claiming her. Across the room, Kael's gaze locked onto hers once more. The confusion was gone from his eyes, replaced by a raw, shocking blaze of possessiveness and absolute certainty. A low, guttural growl escaped his lips, a sound of pure, untamed instinct that cut through the noise of the banquet like a thunderclap. In that moment, she understood with a horrifying clarity that her simple wish for invisibility was gone forever. The strange current that had been building all night had just found its source, and it was her. Chapter 3. The Unspoken Claim. The aftermath of that growl was a blanket of absolute silence. Every conversation stopped, every head turned. The air, once thick with celebration, was now stretched thin with a tension so sharp it felt like it could slice through steel. Selene's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden quiet. She was the center of it all, the focal point of hundreds of pairs of eyes. It was her worst nightmare come to life. Her legs felt weak, her instinct screaming at her to run, to bolt from the hall and never look back. but she was frozen, pinned in place by the weight of their collective stare and the burning intensity of one man's gaze. Seizing upon the charged atmosphere, a hulking warrior named Jax, known more for his cruelty than his courage, stepped forward. A sneer twisted his lips. "What's this, Alpha Kael?" he boomed, his voice dripping with mock disbelief. "Surely the great Shadowclaw Alpha isn't interested in damaged goods. She's too fat to be a warrior, too soft to be a proper mate. She's too much, and not enough, to ever be a Luna." Laughter erupted around him, a cruel, ugly wave of sound that crashed over Selene. It was every whispered insult she had ever endured, now shouted for the entire world to hear. The sound ripped through her, tearing down the last of her defenses. Tears burned at the back of her eyes, hot and furious. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. She would not cry. Instead of breaking, something inside her snapped. The years of quiet shame and swallowed pain ignited into a single, blazing spark of defiance. But before she could even think of what to do, a shadow fell over her. Kael moved. He didn't rush. He descended from the head table like an avalanche, a slow, unstoppable force of nature. Each step he took was silent, deliberate, and full of a menace that choked the laughter in the warriors' throats. The air crackled around him, thick with power and a rage so potent it was almost visible. He came to a stop directly in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body and smell that intoxicating storm scent clinging to him. He was a wall of muscle and fury, shielding her from the pack. He didn't look at her. His molten gold eyes were fixed on Jax, and the look in them was utterly devoid of mercy. It was the look of a predator that had just found its prey. "You will never," Kael began, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated through Selene's very bones. "Speak of her again." It wasn't a request. It was a law. Jax, though arrogant, was not a fool. He paled, the sweat beading on his brow. "Alpha, I meant no disrespect." "You disrespected what is mine," Kael stated, the words simple, yet they landed with the force of a death sentence. He then slowly turned his head, his gaze finally falling to meet hers. The inferno of his rage softened, just for a moment, into something else. Something possessive. Something that shook her to her core. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching the mark on her neck where a mate's claim would be made. The touch was electric, sending a jolt through her entire body. In front of her father, in front of her tormentors, in front of the entire pack, Alpha Kael leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear. The world narrowed to the feeling of his breath against her skin, and the single devastating word he whispered, a word that sealed her fate and shattered her reality into a million pieces. "Mine." The silence that followed was different. It was no longer just tense. It was a void of pure, unadulterated shock. Selene could only stare into his golden eyes, her own reflection warped in their depths, seeing not the fat, unworthy girl, but the chosen possession of the most feared alpha on the continent. Her life was no longer her own. Chapter 4. The Gilded Mark. The single word "mine" echoed in the cavern of silence he had created. It was not a whisper of affection. It was a chisel, carving his ownership into the very stone of the Great Hall. Selene felt her entire body go rigid. This wasn't a rescue, this was a claiming, an act of possession so absolute it stripped the air from her lungs and replaced it with ice. Her father, Alpha Marcus, looked on with a stunned, unreadable expression, his authority evaporating like mist in the face of Kael's raw power. The man before her hadn't just silenced her tormentors, he had stolen her future, replacing the familiar cage of her father's indifference with a new, terrifying one, made of gold and shadow. Without another word, Kael's hand moved from her neck to her arm, his grip firm, but not painful. A silent command. He began to lead her from the alcove, and the pack parted before them like a river splitting around a great stone. Whispers erupted in their wake, a venomous hiss that slithered after her. "It's a power play," someone breathed. He's making an example of her. The ultimate insult. To claim the one no one else wants, just to prove he can. Each word was a fresh sting. Humiliation burned away her shock, leaving behind a cold, hard knot of fury in her stomach. He hadn't seen her strength as Alara had claimed. He had seen a tool, a pawn, a way to assert his dominance over her father's pack. She stumbled and his grip tightened, holding her steady. The simple, physical act of support felt like a mockery. He led her to a small antechamber, the door closing behind them with a heavy thud that sealed them in. The sudden quiet was more deafening than the noise of the hall. "We leave at dawn," Kael stated, his back to her as he stared into the cold fireplace. His voice was flat, a declaration of fact. The fury inside Selene finally found a voice. "No." The word was small, choked, but it was there. It was the bravest sound she had ever made. He turned slowly, one eyebrow raised in faint surprise. "That wasn't a request." "I don't care," she shot back, her voice gaining a tremor of strength. "You can't just do this. You can't just walk in here and claim me like a spoil of war." He took a step closer, and she had to fight the instinct to shrink back. His sheer size was overwhelming. "I can," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous murmur. "And I have." Before she could protest further, his hand shot out, his fingers tangling in her hair to tilt her head back. Her heart leaped into her throat. His golden eyes bored into hers, searching for something she couldn't name. Then, he lowered his head, and his teeth grazed the sensitive skin of her neck, right over her pulse. She gasped, a jolt of pure, terrifying energy flashing through her. There was a sharp, biting sting, and then a searing heat bloomed beneath her skin, a warmth that spread through her veins like liquid fire. A gasp tore from her lips as the magic of the bond settled, a permanent, undeniable brand on her soul. He had marked her. It was done. He pulled back, his eyes darker now, and the look on his face was one of grim satisfaction. The silent message was clear. "You belong to me now, there is no escape." Chapter 5, An Uncaged Fury. Dawn arrived not with gentle light, but with the heavy tread of boots outside her chamber door. Reality crashed down on Selene with the force of a physical blow. This was happening. Two of Kael's warriors, grim-faced and silent, stood waiting in the hallway. They were there to escort her, to transport her like a piece of cargo from her home to the cold, unknown lands of the Shadowclaw Pack. She looked around the room she'd grown up in. A place of loneliness, yes, but a familiar one. The thought of leaving it, of being torn from the only life she'd ever known, ignited the cold fury from the night before into a blazing inferno. She would not be herded like sheep. Consequently, when Kael appeared in the doorway expecting to find her ready, he found her sitting on her bed, arms crossed, surrounded by untouched traveling cloaks. She hadn't packed a single thing. His jaw tightened, the only sign of his displeasure. The air crackled with a silent confrontation, a battle of wills waged in the quiet of her room. His warriors shifted uncomfortably, feeling the palpable tension between their alpha and his new mate. "I am not going," Selene said, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. "This is childish," Kael responded, his tone clipped and devoid of emotion. He stepped inside, dwarfing the space with his presence. "You are my mate. Your place is with me." "Your mate?" she scoffed, rising to her feet to face him. "You mean your prize? Your pawn? Did you enjoy it, Alpha Kael? The look on my father's face when you asserted your dominance by claiming his worthless daughter?" Each word was laced with the pain he had caused. "You didn't save me. You just put me in a different cage." He remained impassive, his face a mask of stone. "You know nothing." "I know you humiliated me," she cried, taking a bold step closer. "You think I don't hear them? They think you marked me as a joke. And you know what? I think they're right." Just as he opened his mouth to reply, a silky, unwelcome voice cut through the tension from the hallway. "Having trouble with your new pet, Kael?" Alpha Daemon from the Red Fang pack leaned against the doorframe, a cruel smirk on his handsome face. His eyes roamed over Selene with open disgust. I must say, I never figured you for having such common tastes. Still, I suppose even a cast-off bitch can warm a bed. The world went still. The insult hung in the air, vile and poisonous. Before Selene could even process the words, Kael moved. He was a blur of black leather and controlled violence. One moment he was in front of her. The next he had Damon slammed against the opposite wall, his forearm crushing the other alpha's throat. A low, guttural growl ripped from Kael's chest, a sound so feral it made the stone walls seem to tremble. His eyes were no longer just gold, they were blazing suns of pure fury. Apologize, Kael snarled, the words a serrated edge against Damon's skin. Damon choked, his face turning purple, clawing at Kael's arm. Apologize. To her. Terrified, Damon could only manage a strangled gurgle. Kael pressed harder, and the sound of cracking bone echoed in the hallway. He was going to kill him. Right here, for her, for an insult. Kael's warriors took a step forward, their faces pale. Finally, with a visible, shuddering effort, Kael released him. Damon collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. Kael gave him one last look of utter loathing before turning his back. He faced Selene, his chest heaving, the inferno in his eyes slowly banking back to a cold, icy calm. He had nearly killed another alpha for her. The chilling, possessive act was so at odds with his cold words that it left her breathless and utterly confused. Chapter 6. The Shadow in the Woods. The journey to the Shadowclaw territory was a silent, tense affair. They traveled on horseback, flanked by Kael's warriors. Selene rode beside him, the space between them a chasm of unspoken questions and simmering hostility. The image of him choking Alpha Damon was burned into her mind. Such violence, such swift and brutal possessiveness, did not align with the idea of a political game. It was something deeper, something far more primal, and it frightened her. Why would he care so much about an insult if she was just a tool? The path led them from open plains into a dense, ancient forest where the canopy of leaves was so thick it blotted out the sun, plunging them into a perpetual twilight. As the woods deepened, an uneasy feeling began to crawl up Selene's spine. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. The normal sounds of the forest, the chatter of birds, the rustle of small animals had fallen silent. There was only the sound of their horses' hooves on the soft ground and the feeling of being watched by 100 unseen eyes. One of Kael's warriors muttered a curse, his hand drifting to the hilt of his sword. Kael himself was rigid in his saddle, his head constantly scanning the oppressive shadows that crowded the path, his nostrils flared. He knew they were not alone. The attack came without warning. A chorus of snarling howls erupted from the trees, and dark shapes burst from the undergrowth. Rogues. Their eyes were wild with madness and hunger, their fur matted with mud and old blood. They were feral, driven by instinct, and their target was immediately clear. Her. One lunged for her horse, claws extended. Before it could connect, Kael was there, a blur of motion as he leaped from his saddle, a massive, wicked-looking blade appearing in his hand as if from nowhere. He moved with a speed and brutality that was inhuman, cutting through the rogues with a deadly grace. But as the fight raged on, a terrifying change came over him. His movements grew wilder, his strikes more vicious. A low, continuous growl rumbled in his chest, and a dark, terrifying energy began to pour off him in waves. After the last rogue fell with a final, gurgling cry, Kael did not stop. He stood over the corpse, his body trembling, his knuckles white on the hilt of his sword. His head snapped up and he looked around, his eyes no longer the familiar gold she knew. They were blazing pools of molten red, consumed by a bloodlust that had not been sated. He was lost. This was not the controlled warrior from moments before. This was a monster. He turned, his red gaze landing on one of his own warriors who had sustained a minor injury. He took a predatory step toward his man, the sword raising, the snarl on his lips inhuman. The curse. Her mind screamed, This was his secret. This was his shame. "Kael!" Selene's voice was a desperate cry, cutting through the haze of his rage. His head snapped toward her, the red eyes locking on her with a frightening intensity. He looked like he didn't even recognize her. He took a step in her direction, a monster drawn to a new target. Fear lanced through her, cold and sharp, but she held her ground. She saw the flicker of struggle deep within that crimson inferno, the man fighting the beast. "Kael," she repeated, her voice softer this time, a plea. He stopped, his body shuddering with a violent tremor. A raw, agonized sound was torn from his throat as he fought an internal war she could only guess at. He squeezed his eyes shut, and when he opened them again, the terrifying red had receded, leaving behind his familiar golden gaze, now filled with a raw, horrifying vulnerability. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and what she saw in his eyes was not anger or dominance, but a stark, bone-deep fear. In that moment, an impossible truth slammed into her. The mark on her neck, the bond he had forced upon her. It wasn't a cage. It was his anchor, and he was terrified of dragging her down with him. Chapter 7. The Den of Whispers. The Shadowclaw Fortress was not a home. It was a mountain's heart, carved from dark stone and ancient, unyielding timber. It rose from the earth like a predator's tooth, all sharp angles and imposing shadows, a perfect reflection of the alpha who ruled it. As Selene was led through the massive gates, a chilling silence fell over the bustling courtyard. Every head turned, every pair of eyes, cold, curious, and sharp with judgment, fixed on her. The air, crisp with the scent of pine and cold stone, grew heavy with the weight of their scrutiny. This was her new life, a den of wolves where she was the strange, unwelcome prey. Her resolve, forged in the fear and revelation of the forest, threatened to crack. Following Kael's broad back into the cavernous great hall, the whispers started, a low rustle like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "That's her? So soft-looking. Why would our alpha choose one so unremarkable?" The words were different from the insults of her home pack, yet they stung all the same. Here, her crime wasn't her size, but her simple existence. She was an outsider, a disruption to their fierce, orderly world. She straightened her spine, lifting her chin in a show of defiance she did not feel. She would not let them see her break. Not today. As they approached the central staircase, a formidable she-wolf with a scarred face stepped forward, her expression a mask of contempt. She looked Selene up and down, a dismissive sneer twisting her lips. "Alpha," the warrior said, her voice rough as gravel. "Is this thing to be our Luna?" Before the insult could fully land, Kael stopped. He didn't turn or speak to the warrior. Instead, he placed a hand on the small of Selene's back, a simple, proprietary gesture. His touch was warm against the thin fabric of her dress, a startling point of heat in the cold, cavernous hall. It was not a gesture of tenderness. It was a statement of ownership, a silent, undeniable command. "She is with me. She is off limits." The hall fell silent once more, the challenging warrior lowering her gaze in grudging submission. He had defended her without a single word, and the sheer power of that silent act was more potent than any shout. He led her up the stairs to a heavy oak door, which opened into a vast, richly appointed chamber. A huge bed, a stone fireplace, and furs thick enough to sink into. It was a room fit for a queen, but the windows were high and narrow, like the eyes of a fortress, and the door closed behind her with a sound of finality. It was a luxurious cage. Kael stood in the doorway, his face once again an unreadable mask. The protector from the great hall was gone, replaced by the cold, distant alpha. "You will be safe here," he stated, his voice flat. "Do not cause trouble." He left without another word, the lock clicking shut behind him. The contradiction was dizzying. The public display of possession, the silent defense, and now this cold, dismissive command. It left Selene standing in the middle of her new prison, wondering if he was protecting her or merely guarding his newest, most problematic possession. Chapter 8. The first spark of a fire daze bled into a lonely, suffocating routine. Selene was a ghost in Kael's fortress, fed in her chambers, ignored by the pack, and watched from a distance by her silent, brooding mate. The feeling of helplessness, a familiar cloak from her old life, began to settle around her again. But now, it felt different. It chafed. The memory of Kael's vulnerability in the woods, the terrifying glimpse of his inner battle, had planted a seed of purpose in her. She could not be a liability. She would not be a fragile piece of baggage he was forced to protect. If she was to be his anchor, she needed to be made of stone, not glass. Driven by this new, unfamiliar resolve, she sought out the one person in the entire fortress who seemed as overlooked as she was, an old she-wolf named Tarja, an omega who tended the lonely gardens at the back of the keep. Selene had watched her, had seen the whipcord strength in her wiry frame and the quiet intelligence in her pale, knowing eyes. One crisp morning, Selene found her sharpening a spade. "I want you to teach me," Selene said, the words coming out in a rush before her courage could fail her. Tarja looked up, her expression unreadable. "Teach you what, little Luna?" "How to fight," Selene stated, her chin high. "How to be strong." A slow, knowing smile touched the old wolf's lips. "Strength isn't taught, it's forged. Come back at dusk, and don't be seen." That evening, in a secluded clearing behind the gardens, her training began. It was a disaster. Tarja put a heavy wooden practice sword in her hand, and it felt like a clumsy, foreign object. Her swings were wide, her footwork a tangled mess. She was breathless in minutes, her muscles screaming in protest, her body a clumsy burden she couldn't command. Tarja was relentless, her instructions quiet but firm. "Again!" Selene lunged, tripping over her own feet and landing hard in the dirt. Humiliation stung her cheeks. "The ground will always be there to catch you," Tarja said, her voice even. "Get up. Again." Hours turned into days. Selene's body ached with a profound weariness she had never known. Her arms were covered in bruises from blocked strikes. But with every fall, with every failure, the soft shell of her despair was chipped away, revealing something harder underneath. The frustration boiled into determination. The pain sharpened into focus. Then, one evening, it happened. A swift strike from Tarja came at her head. Instead of stumbling back, Selene moved, her body finally remembering the endless drills. She pivoted, bringing her wooden sword up in a smooth, solid block that met the attack with a sharp clack. The force of it vibrated up her arm, but she held her ground. It was a small thing, a single successful move, but it was hers. A flicker of pride, fierce and bright, ignited in her chest. For the first time, she felt capable. Just as a genuine smile touched her lips, a presence at the edge of the clearing made the air go cold. Kael stood there, half hidden by the shadows of the trees. His face was a mask of stone, his golden eyes fixed on the practice sword in her hand. He said nothing. He did nothing. He just watched, his silent, unreadable judgment a heavier weight than any physical blow. Chapter 9. A Voice of Stone and Steel. Kael never spoke of the training. His silence was a strange, unnerving permission that only made Selene push herself harder. The fear of his disapproval was a whetstone, sharpening her resolve. A week after he'd found her in the clearing, he summoned her with a single curt nod. He was heading to a meeting of the Pack Council, and she was to accompany him. She walked beside him, her heart a nervous flutter. She was sure her role was to be a silent symbol of his claim, a pretty possession to display before his inner circle. The council chamber was an intimidating ring of stone, dominated by a massive round table of petrified wood. The elders and pack leaders, the core of Kael's power, watched her with expressions ranging from veiled curiosity to open hostility. The meeting was a tense debate about the pack's dwindling food stores as the first snows threatened the mountains. An elder named Garrus, a wolf with a clear ambition to undermine his alpha, presented a report. He argued for a high-risk hunt into the treacherous northern peaks, citing unusually sparse herds in their traditional hunting grounds. His data was convincing, his arguments forceful. He was boxing Kael into a corner. Refuse and look weak, or agree, and risk losing warriors in a foolish gamble. Listening to the arguments, a cold knot of dread formed in Selene's stomach. Something was wrong. In her father's pack, she'd been ignored, but she'd listened. She'd learned the rhythms of the land. She knew the migration patterns of the great elk herds. Garrus's timeline was off. The herds wouldn't be in the northern peaks for another month. Right now, they would be in the sheltered valleys to the east. Garrus wasn't just wrong, he was lying, setting his alpha up for a catastrophic failure. Her blood ran cold. To speak was to invite their scorn, to challenge a powerful elder in a room full of strangers. To remain silent was to watch Kael walk into a trap. She looked at Kael, saw the hard line of his jaw as he weighed the impossible choice. And in that moment, her fear was eclipsed by a fierce, startling wave of protectiveness. "He's wrong," Selene said. The words fell into a shocked silence. Every head swiveled to face her. Garrus's eyes narrowed into slits of fury. "The herds are not in the peaks," she continued, her voice trembling but clear. She stood, forcing herself to meet their hostile stares. "They are in the eastern valleys. They shelter there after the first frost, before moving north. Your hunting parties will find nothing but snow and wind. You will lose warriors for nothing." "And how would you know, little pup?" Garrus sneered. "Did you read it in a book?" "I saw it," Selene countered, her voice gaining strength. "For years I watched from my window. I saw the patterns. If you send scouts to the sunken valley, you will find your game. There will be enough to last the winter without risking a single life." The council stared, stunned by her audacity and the simple, undeniable logic of her claim. She had offered a third option, one that was both safe and smart. Later that night, Kael found her staring out the high window of her chamber. "You did well today," he said from the doorway, the words a rare and startling admission. She turned, a flicker of warmth in her chest. "But," he continued, stepping into the room, his shadow consuming the space, "you have made a powerful enemy. Garrus will not forget this. Be careful." The warmth vanished, replaced by a chill. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning, delivered with the same cold gravity with which he commanded his armies. She had won a victory, had earned a sliver of respect, but in doing so, she had just stepped onto the battlefield herself. Chapter 10. Echoes in the Stone. In the wake of the council meeting, a subtle shift occurred. Selene was no longer just a ghost in the fortress. She was a presence, a whisper of power. This new, unnerving visibility made her more observant, her senses honed by the constant feeling of being watched. She learned the fortress's secret paths, the corridors where sound traveled in strange ways. It was in one of these shadowed hallways near the armory that she heard the voices. They were low and conspiratorial, the venomous tones of Elder Garrus and two of his loyal warriors. They thought they were alone. They were wrong. "The route is set," Garrus was saying, his voice a low rumble of discontent. "He patrols the eastern ridge at Moon High. The gorge is narrow there." "A rock slide?" one of the warriors asked. "Plausible," Garrus sneered. "Tragic. An alpha weakened by his new mate's distractions, grown careless. The pack will demand a stronger leader, someone who isn't blinded by an unworthy stray." A cold dread, sharp and immediate, washed over Selene. This was no mere grumbling. This was treason. They were planning to kill Kael, to orchestrate his death and make it look like an accident. Her first instinct was fear, a primal urge to retreat into the shadows and forget what she'd heard. But it was quickly consumed by a white-hot surge of fury. They spoke of Kael's weakness, but she had seen his strength. She had seen the monster he battled every single day. These men, planning murder in the shadows, were the true weaklings. Without a second thought, she turned and moved through the fortress, her purpose a silent, driving force. She found Kael in his study, a stark room lined with maps and ancient texts. He stood before a crackling fire, the light playing over the hard lines of his face. He looked tired. "They're planning to kill you," she said, the words spilling out without preamble. He turned, his golden eyes narrowing, his expression dismissive. "Pack politics are not your concern." "This isn't politics, it's an ambush," she insisted, stepping closer, refusing to be intimidated. "Garrus, he and his men. They plan to trigger a rock slide at the eastern ridge when you patrol tonight." He stared at her, his face a mask of cold skepticism. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought he wouldn't believe her, that he would cast her aside as a hysterical female. "I heard them," she pressed, her voice low and urgent. "They think you're weak because of me. They're using me as the excuse to murder you." The mention of her name, used as a weapon against him, seemed to strike a chord. He studied her face, searching her eyes, and the icy disbelief finally began to thaw. He saw the genuine fear, the raw fury on his behalf. The mask didn't fall, but a crack appeared. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "You have sharp ears, Selene." It was the first time he had ever said her name with anything other than command. The quiet words were a fragile thread of trust, woven in the space between them. He turned to the door, his movements once again filled with deadly purpose. He was not heading for the eastern ridge. He was going hunting, but not for game. The subtle shift in their dynamic was profound. She had warned him, and he had listened. She was no longer just his possession. She was his eyes and ears in the shadows he could not watch. Chapter 11. The Devil in the Blood. Kael dealt with the traitors swiftly and silently. Garrus and his men were gone by morning, their absence a cold, unspoken warning to the rest of the pack. But the betrayal left Kael coiled tight as a steel spring, a dark, restless energy rolling off him in waves. That evening, he announced he was hunting alone, his command to the entire fortress absolute and chilling. "No one follows me." Selene watched him stride out into the encroaching twilight, his frame radiating a tension that was more than just anger. It was a desperate need for release. And it terrified her. His warning screamed at her to stay behind, to lock her door and wait for the storm to pass. But a deeper, more primal instinct, the one that had recognized him in the great hall, urged her forward. Concern, sharp and undeniable, overrode her fear. She had to know. Breaking his direct command, she slipped out of the keep, following his path into the darkening woods. The air grew colder as she moved deeper, the trees clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. She found him in a moon-drenched clearing. He wasn't hunting. He was fighting. A horrible, guttural snarl ripped through the air, a sound of pure agony. He was on his knees, his head thrown back, his body convulsing. His clothes were torn, his skin marred by deep gashes she realized with horror were self-inflicted. As she watched, his form seemed to twist and elongate, his bones cracking with sounds that made her stomach heave. This wasn't a calm transformation. This was a war. The thing that rose to its feet was not Kael. It was a nightmare of fur and shadow, larger than any wolf she had ever seen, its fur the color of night, its claws like shards of obsidian, and its eyes. They were not gold. They were twin pits of burning blood-red embers, filled with nothing but pure, undiluted rage. This was the curse she had glimpsed before, but in its full, unrestrained horror. It was a demon wearing his skin, and it was in agony. The beast roared, a sound of torment and fury, and began to destroy the clearing, tearing at ancient trees with its claws, ripping boulders from the earth. It was a storm of self-hatred, a desperate attempt to exhaust the fire that was consuming it from within. It sensed her. The red eyes snapped to her location, the beast freezing in its path of destruction. A low, predatory growl rumbled in its chest. It saw her not as his mate, but as something to be annihilated. It lowered its head and charged. Terror, absolute and paralyzing, seized her. Every instinct screamed at her to run. But she was frozen, not by fear, but by a sudden, heartbreaking clarity. She was not looking at a monster. She was looking at a prisoner. He skidded to a halt just feet away, the force of his stop tearing up the ground. He snarled, saliva dripping from his massive jaws, the red eyes burning with a promise of death. "Kael," she whispered, the name a fragile prayer in the face of the hurricane. The beast flinched, a flicker of confusion warring with the rage. It took another step, the growl deepening. She did the bravest, most foolish thing of her life. She took a step forward, raising a trembling hand. "Kael, it's me." He lunged, but she didn't retreat. She reached out and pressed her palm flat against the beast's massive, heaving chest. The moment her skin touched his fur, the beast screamed, a sound of agony and shock, and was thrown back as if struck by lightning. The blood-red rage recoiled from her touch, from the bond they shared. He collapsed, the monstrous form shrinking and twisting until the man was left in its place, naked and trembling on the cold ground. He looked up at her, his golden eyes wide with a desperate, shattered vulnerability. The wall between them was gone, incinerated by the flames of his curse, and in its place was a truth that could no longer be denied. She was his only salvation. Chapter 12. An Alliance of Scars. They returned to the keep under the cloak of darkness, the space between them charged with the unspoken horror and intimacy of the clearing. The physical walls of the fortress felt flimsy compared to the emotional one that had just been demolished between them. He was scarred and silent, she was shaken and resolute. Before either could process the monumental shift, a summons came. An emergency council. A rival had arrived. Selene's blood ran cold as she entered the council chamber beside Kael to find Alpha Damon, his neck still bruised from their last encounter, standing there with a smug, vindictive smile. He had not come alone. "Alpha Kael," Damon began, his voice oozing false respect. "I have come because a grave matter has been brought to my attention, a matter that concerns the stability of your pack and your fitness to lead it." He unfurled a scroll, its parchment ancient and brittle. "I have here a sworn testimony from a former elder of the Shadowclaw pack, long since exiled, describing a curse of blood rage that runs in your family line, a madness that consumes the Alpha and turns him into an uncontrollable beast." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the council. Kael's face was a mask of cold, deadly fury. But Selene, who could now see past the stone facade, saw the flicker of hunted desperation in his eyes. His greatest secret, the demon he fought in the lonely places of the forest, had just been dragged into the light for all to see. He was cornered, exposed, and alone. "These are the lies of a traitor," one of Kael's loyal elders boomed. "Is it?" Damon countered smoothly. "Then why don't you deny it, Kael? Tell them all that the devil is not in your blood." All eyes turned to Kael. He stood tall, his silence a damning confession. His entire world was poised to crumble around him, built on a secret now laid bare. Before he could respond with the violence that was surely building in his chest, Selene stepped forward. Her heart hammered, but her voice was cold and clear, cutting through the tension. "He does not deny it," she said, her words shocking the council into silence. She turned to face the stunned elders. "You call it a curse, a madness. I call it a battle. I have seen the beast you speak of, and I have seen the man who fights it every single day and wins. Who among you has ever faced such a war within himself and remained standing?" She moved to Kael's side, her shoulder brushing his arm, a silent, unshakable declaration. "Your Alpha is not weak because of this burden. He is stronger than any of you can possibly imagine because he carries it. His control is not a gift. It is a discipline forged in a fire you will never know. I stand with him. Your Luna stands with him." Her speech, a defense born of absolute conviction, hung in the air. She had not only accepted his darkest part, she had declared it a source of his strength. The tide of opinion in the room began to shift, from fear to a grudging, shocked respect. Their alliance was no longer a secret, but a public proclamation. As the council erupted into chaotic argument, Selene's eyes scanned the room. Standing near the back, among Damon's delegation, was a face from her past. Liam, a warrior from her home pack, the boy whose attention she had once craved, the one who had never given her a second glance. He was staring at her now, his expression a mixture of shock and a new, calculating interest. The past had just walked into her present, threatening a future she was just beginning to believe in. Chapter 13. Ghosts of the Past. The uneasy alliance Selene had forged with the council was a fragile thing, a thin sheet of ice over a raging river of doubt. In this chaos, Liam sought her out. She found him waiting for her in the snow-dusted quiet of the western garden, the place where she had first learned the weight of a sword. He looked different here, softer than he had in the tense council chamber, his familiar face a relic from a life that felt 1,000 years away. He offered her a smile, the same easy, charming smile that had once made her teenage heart ache with a wanting so sharp it was a physical pain. "Selene," he began, his voice smooth as polished stone. "I wanted to find you, to apologize. I was a fool back home. Blind. I never truly saw you." His words were a ghost of a dream she'd once had, a fantasy where the handsome warrior finally noticed her. But hearing them now, they felt hollow, wrong. The Selene who had craved his attention was gone, burned away by humiliation and forged into something new by fear and loyalty. She saw the truth in his eyes. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the Luna of the Shadowclaw pack, a creature of power and status. He was attracted to the reflection of Kael's power on her, not the woman herself. "You're right," Selene said, her voice quiet but firm, holding none of the breathless gratitude he clearly expected. "You didn't see me." A flicker of confusion crossed his face. He took a step closer, his expression shifting to one of earnest sincerity. "Let me make up for it. Damon is a brute. He promises power, but Kael is a monster. I've heard the stories. You don't have to be chained to him. Come with us. I can protect you." The offer was a poisoned dart disguised as a lifeline. He was asking her to betray Kael, to abandon the one person who, in his own brutal way, had seen her from the very beginning. Kael had seen her hiding in the shadows of the Great Hall. He had seen her fear and her defiance. He had seen the woman fighting the demon inside him. Liam had only seen a prize to be won. "The difference between you and him," Selene said, the clarity of the thought making her voice as cold and sharp as the winter air, "is that you only see me now, when I have his name. He saw me when I was nothing but the girl everyone laughed at." She held his gaze, letting the weight of her choice settle between them. She was no longer the girl who needed his validation. Her worth was not something to be granted by a handsome boy's fleeting attention. It was something she was building herself, stone by painful stone. "My place is with my alpha," she finished, the words feeling more true than anything she had ever said. She turned her back on him, on the ghost of the girl she used to be, and walked away without a second glance. She did not need to see the look on his face to know what was there. She could feel it on her back. The sting of a man's pride wounded, a look of rejection curdling into a cold, quiet promise of revenge. She had made her choice, and in doing so, had just created an enemy more dangerous than she could imagine. Chapter 14. Trial by Fire. Selene's public defiance and Liam's spurned departure left the pack in a state of simmering unrest. To solidify her position and silence the dissenters, the elders invoked an ancient tradition, the Luna's trial. It wasn't a test of combat, but of spirit. Selene was to walk the path of whispers, a magically charged labyrinth beneath the keep. It was said the path would conjure a wolf's deepest insecurities, forcing them to face the lies they told themselves. If she emerged before the moon reached its zenith, the pack would accept her as their true Luna. To fail was to be deemed unworthy, her bond to the Alpha forever questioned. She entered the labyrinth with a single torch, the heavy stone door grinding shut behind her. The air was cold and still. Almost immediately the whispers began, slithering from the shadows. They were the voices of her past, amplified by magic. Too fat to be Luna. Damaged goods. He claimed you as a joke. The insults of her youth, the taunts from her father's hall, echoed around her, each word a ghostly finger poking at her deepest wounds. The old Selene would have crumpled, but the training with Tarja had taught her more than how to hold a sword. It had taught her endurance. She gritted her teeth, focusing on the flickering light of her torch and the feel of the solid ground beneath her feet. But as she went deeper, the illusions grew more sinister. The path ahead of her seemed to crumble away into a chasm, a vision of her falling into nothingness. A ghostly image of her father appeared, his face etched with disappointment, telling her she was and always would be a failure. This was more than a trial of spirit. The magic felt wrong, vicious. It was actively trying to harm her. Sabotage. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She came to the final chamber where a spectral version of Kael stood. His eyes were cold, and he sneered at her. "Did you really think I wanted you?" The illusion hissed. "You are my curse, my weakness." The words were designed to be the final killing blow, and they hurt. But as she looked into the illusion's eyes, she saw they were flat, empty. They held none of the tormented fire she had seen in the real Kael's gaze. They held none of the vulnerability. This was a puppet, not a man. "You're not him," she whispered, her voice filled with a sudden, absolute certainty. She walked forward, right through the illusion, which dissolved like smoke. Beyond it, resting on a pedestal, was a single, perfect moon-petal flower, the objective of the trial. But at the base of the pedestal, she saw it. A small, dark rune, carved into the stone, still pulsing with a faint, malevolent energy. It was a corruption rune, a forbidden magic designed to turn illusions deadly. She carefully wrapped the rune in a piece of her cloak and took the flower. When she emerged from the labyrinth, victorious, into the waiting hall, she didn't just present the moon petal. She unrolled the cloth and showed the elders the rune. "The trial was corrupted," she announced, her voice ringing with authority. An investigation was launched, and the rune was traced back to 2 of Garrus's remaining loyalists who had been aided by Liam before he fled. She had not only passed their test, she had exposed traitors in their midst. She had earned her title. Later, in the quiet of his study, Kael came to her. He didn't speak. He simply reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from her face, his touch surprisingly gentle. The admiration in his eyes was raw, unveiled. "They see a Luna," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. "All I see is the woman who makes me human." Chapter 15. The blood. Selene's triumph in the trial was a turning point. It silenced the whispers and won her the grudging respect of even the most hardened warriors. For a brief, blissful moment, a fragile peace settled over the Shadowclaw pack. But her victory had also cornered her enemies, leaving them with no choice but to abandon subtlety. The peace was shattered when Alpha Daemon strode into the Great Hall during the evening meal, flanked by his fiercest champions. He had not come to negotiate. "Your Luna has proven clever," Daemon announced, his voice booming in the suddenly silent hall. "But cleverness cannot mask a fatal flaw in the heart of your pack. It cannot contain a curse that makes your Alpha a danger to you all." He pointed a finger at Kael, who had risen from his seat, his body coiled with a lethal stillness. "The Shadowclaw pack is a powder keg, and your leader is the spark. He is unstable, unfit. I will not stand by while he drags this entire region into the chaos of his madness." Selene's heart began to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She knew what was coming. "I invoke the blood dew," Daemon roared, his voice ringing with triumph. "The ancient law of challenge. I demand a trial by combat for leadership of this pack, to the death or to submission." A wave of shock and horror swept through the hall. The blood dew was a brutal, archaic law, a relic from a more savage time, but it was still binding. To refuse was an admission of guilt and fear, an automatic forfeiture of the title, and a death sentence in itself. Kael had no choice. Selene looked at him, at his face carved from stone, and saw the grim, fatalistic acceptance in his eyes. He was trapped. Selene wanted to scream, to protest, to tell them they didn't understand what they were asking of him. They were demanding he unleash the very demon he fought to contain. In a duel, there was no room for control. There was only rage and instinct and survival. They were sentencing him to become the monster they feared, or to die fighting it. Kael's gaze met hers across the space, a silent, fleeting message passing between them. A regret. A farewell. Then he turned his attention back to Damon, his voice low and cold, carrying the weight of his final decision. "I accept your challenge." The words fell like a headsman's axe. The date was set for 3 days' time. All other paths were now closed. There was no escape, no negotiation. The only way forward was through a battle that Kael was almost certain to lose, not to his enemy's strength, but to his own. Selene felt a cold dread wash over her as she realized the terrible truth. The curse that had first bound them together was now destined to be the very thing that would tear him apart in front of the entire world. Chapter 16. The Crimson Ring. The dueling ring was a stark circle of flattened, blood-darkened earth, surrounded by the silent, anxious faces of 2 packs. A cold wind whipped down from the mountain peaks, carrying the scent of snow and fear. Selene stood beside the pack elders, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. She felt like a statue, frozen on the outside while a storm of terror raged within. Kael and Damon entered the ring from opposite sides, circling each other like predators sizing up their kill. Damon was arrogant, his movements fluid and confident, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. Kael was a pillar of lethal calm, his face an unreadable mask. But Selene could see the immense, crushing effort it took to maintain that control. He was fighting a war on 2 fronts, and the battle had only just begun. The fight exploded in a clash of motion. Damon was fast, his strikes aimed to wound, to bleed, to provoke. Kael was a force of pure power, his blocks like stone walls, his counters economical and devastating. But he was holding back. Selene could see it in the rigid line of his shoulders, in the way he pulled his blows just shy of their most brutal potential. He was trying to win without letting the beast off its leash. He was fighting to protect his pack from his opponent, and to protect his opponent from himself. The crowd was a sea of held breaths, the only sounds the grunts of exertion, the sickening thud of fists on flesh, and the scrape of boots on the hard-packed dirt. Damon, sensing Kael's restraint, pressed his advantage. He wasn't just fighting Kael's body. He was attacking his mind. "Is that all you have?" Damon taunted, ducking under a wide swing. "I thought the great alpha of the Shadowclaw pack was a force of nature." Kael didn't answer, his jaw tight. "Or maybe the stories are true," Damon continued, his voice rising for the crowd to hear. "Maybe you're afraid to let him out. What will your pretty little mate think when she sees the monster you really are?" He shot a malicious glance at Selene. "Show her, Kael. Show them all the devil in your blood." The words were a key turning a lock in Kael's soul. Damon feinted left and then landed a vicious kick to Kael's ribs. A sharp crack echoed in the tense silence, and Kael staggered back, a gasp of pain escaping his lips. The physical blow, combined with the venom of Damon's taunts, was too much. The carefully constructed dam of Kael's control began to fracture. Selene saw it first, a flicker of crimson in the gold of his eyes, like a drop of blood in honey. His posture shifted, his movements becoming less controlled, more feral. A low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest, a sound that did not belong to the man. but to the curse he carried. He was slipping. Damon's taunts had worked. He had goaded the beast, and now it was beginning to stir from its cage. The crowd murmured, sensing the shift. Selene could only watch, a silent scream trapped in her throat as the man she loved began to disappear, piece by agonizing piece. Chapter 17. A Traitor's Kiss. The fight was no longer a duel. It was a savage display of escalating brutality. Kael, now fueled by the first taste of his rage, was a whirlwind of destruction. He drove Damon back with a relentless assault, his blows landing with enough force to shatter bone. He was stronger, faster, a true force of nature. But he was also reckless. His defense was sloppy, his movements driven by fury instead of strategy. Damon, though clearly outmatched in raw power, was smiling. He looked like a man who had just successfully lured a great bear into a trap. He was waiting for something. Selene's eyes frantically scanned the crowd, a sense of wrongness crawling over her skin. And then she saw him. Liam. He stood near the edge of the ring, no longer a part of Damon's delegation, but a rogue element in the unfolding chaos. He reached into his cloak, his movements furtive and quick. He wasn't just watching. He was a participant. As Kael lunged, forcing Damon to his knees, Liam's hand shot out. A fine, silvery powder flew from his fingers, catching the wind and drifting invisibly into the ring. Selene's mind screamed a warning, but it was too late. The dust, shimmering with a faint, unnatural light, settled over Kael. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, Kael stopped, his attack freezing mid-swing. A look of confusion, then agony, twisted his features. He clawed at his own chest, a choked, strangled scream tearing from his throat. The silver dust, pure, refined wolfsbane, was not a poison for the body, but for the curse. It didn't weaken the rage. It amplified it into an uncontrollable, agonizing fire while simultaneously attacking the wolf's physical form. The crimson in Kael's eyes exploded, consuming the gold entirely. He was a blind storm of pain and fury, lost to a world of torment that no one else could see. He roared, a sound of such profound agony that it made the entire crowd recoil in horror. He was a wounded, thrashing leviathan, completely at the mercy of the demon within. This was the moment Damon had been waiting for. With Kael crippled by the poisoned rage, Damon surged to his feet. He drew a wicked, curved dagger from his boot, its edge glowing with the telltale sheen of silver. While the beast was lost in its own internal hell, Damon darted in. He plunged the blade deep into Kael's side, twisting it with a vicious, triumphant grunt. The great alpha, the monster of the Shadowclaw pack, collapsed. He fell to the earth not with a roar, but with a choked, wet sound of defeat. He lay there, a massive, bleeding heap of dark fur, snarling weakly at a world he could no longer see. Damon stood over him, raising the bloody dagger to the stunned, silent crowd. From the edge of the ring, Selene saw Liam's face. It was not the face of a reluctant traitor. It was a mask of cold, satisfied triumph. The two men she had allowed to define her, one by her love, the other by her shame, had just conspired to destroy each other and her along with them. Chapter 18. The Ashes of a Luna. The world dissolved into a cacophony of noise and chaos. Damon was declaring his victory, his voice a triumphant roar that echoed in the sudden, horrified silence of the Shadowclaw pack. Warriors were frozen, caught between their loyalty to their fallen alpha and the brutal finality of the ancient law. Kael lay bleeding in the dirt, the magnificent, terrifying beast reduced to a wounded, twitching animal, lost in a prison of pain. And Selene. Selene saw none of it. The sounds faded to a dull, distant hum, the faces of the crowd blurring into a gray watercolor wash. All she could see was Kael's blood seeping into the earth, a dark stain that was all her fault. A tidal wave of self-loathing, colder and more powerful than any she had ever known, crashed over her. Every choice she had made, every step she had taken since that first night at the banquet, had led to this exact moment. A horrifying, perfect logic clicked into place in her mind. each thought a nail being hammered into her soul. It was my fault. If I had never spoken up at the council, Garrus would not have been exposed, and Damon would not have been so bold. If I had not rejected Liam, had not wounded his pride, he would never have betrayed Kael with the poison. If Kael had never seen me, had never marked me, he would never have been in this ring at all. He would be safe. He would be whole. The whispers from her past came back, not as magical illusions, but as undeniable truths. Too fat, too soft, a curse, unworthy. She had tried so hard to become something else. She had trained, she had spoken, she had fought, she had pretended to be a Luna. But it was all a lie. She was, and always had been, a walking disaster. She didn't save people. She broke them. She was a poison far more potent than the one Liam had used. She had brought this ruin upon the only person who had ever looked at her and seen something worth claiming. Her legs gave out, and she sank to her knees in the cold dirt, oblivious to the gasps of those around her. The strength she had built, the fire she had nurtured, all of it turned to ash in her mouth. She was that girl in the crimson dress all over again, small and helpless and wishing only for invisibility. The entire world could burn. It had already ended inside of her. She looked at Kael's dying form, at the monster she had unleashed and the man she had doomed, and felt a profound, soul-shattering emptiness. Hope was a fairy tale, and this was the bitter, brutal end. In the absolute silence of her despair, a single forgotten sound echoed faintly, like a tiny bell ringing miles away. It was Alara's voice, a ghost from a life ago, whispering a phrase she had long since dismissed. Maybe you were meant for more. The thought was not a comfort. It was a mockery, a cruel joke played on a broken girl, kneeling in the ashes of the world she had destroyed. Chapter 19. The Blood Remembers. The memory of Alara's words was a shard of glass in her soul, twisting with every shuddering breath. Meant for more? She was meant for nothing but this, to be the catalyst for ruin, the final, fatal weight that brought a great man crashing to the earth. She knelt in the ashes of her own making, a hollowed-out monument to her own inadequacy. But through the suffocating fog of her despair, something pricked at her. A thin, fraying thread of sensation that was not her own. It was Kael. Through the bond, that indelible mark on her soul, she could feel him. She felt the silver's icy burn, the wolfsbane's agonizing fire, and the slow, terrifying ebb of his life force as it drained into the cold ground. The sensation was a lifeline, pulling her out of the drowning depths of her self-pity. She focused on it, on him, and another memory surfaced, sharp and vivid. The clearing in the woods, the monster with red eyes. Her hand pressed against its chest. The beast hadn't just calmed. It had recoiled, screamed as if struck by lightning. It wasn't just the mate bond. It was her. Something in her blood, in her very essence, was anathema to the curse's rage. Why? Alara's words returned, no longer a mockery, but a question. What if she was right? A phantom memory, hazy and distant, flickered in her mind. Her mother, a woman she barely remembered, humming a strange, ancient lullaby, her touch cool and calming on Selene's fevered brow as a child. Her father had always said her mother was from a weak bloodline, a fact he'd hidden in shame. But what if it wasn't weakness? What if it was something else entirely? A different kind of power, so old and quiet it was mistaken for fragility. The knowledge bloomed in her heart not as a thought, but as an instinct. A truth her own blood was screaming at her. She wasn't just a werewolf. She was something more. A lichen, a balancer, an anchor not by chance but by birthright. The realization was a bolt of lightning that incinerated her despair. The shame, the guilt, the feeling of unworthiness, it all burned away, leaving behind a core of pure, unadulterated purpose, as hard and bright as a diamond. She was not the cause of his downfall. She was his only chance at survival. Her blood was the key. Her touch was the cure. Slowly, deliberately, Selene rose to her feet. The movement was a declaration. The girl who had crumpled to her knees was gone, and in her place stood a queen. The noise of the crowd rushed back in, but it was just a distant roar. Her eyes, no longer clouded with tears but blazing with an icy, determined fire, fixed on the chaos in the ring. Damon was posturing, Liam was melting back into the crowd, and Kael was dying. She began to walk. Every step was heavy, measured, and absolute. Warriors, frozen in their shock, turned to look at her, their expressions shifting from pity to stunned disbelief. She was not a grieving mate stumbling toward her fallen alpha. She was a storm moving toward its epicenter, and nothing on this earth was going to stand in her way. Chapter 20, A Queen's Gambit. As Selene stepped into the blood-soaked ring, Damon turned, his triumphant speech dying on his lips. He saw the look in her eyes, and his smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. "The duel is over, little Luna," he sneered, regaining his composure. "Go weep in a corner, this pack is mine." The blood dew is not complete until the alpha's heart stops beating. Selene's voice was not loud, but it cut through the wind with the chilling authority of a death sentence. "You are a coward who used poison and a traitor's trick to fell a man worth 10 of you. Now get out of my way." The sheer, unexpected force of her command stunned him into silence. She didn't wait for his response. Her gaze swept over the crowd, finding the faces she knew she could trust. "Tarja," she called out, her voice ringing with power. "Raynor, to me. We are moving him to the healing dens. Now, bar the door. No one enters but those I allow. No one." For a heartbeat, the pack remained frozen. Then Kael's most loyal warriors surged forward, their loyalty to their Luna snapping into place with her command. They saw what she had become, not just Kael's mate, but their last hope. They gently lifted Kael's massive, wounded form, his body still twitching with the curse's agony, and began to move. Damon could only watch, sputtering in impotent rage, as his victory was snatched from him by the very woman he'd dismissed as a worthless prize. Inside the stone confines of the healing den, the situation was dire. The silver dagger was still lodged in Kael's side, and the wolf's bane had sent the curse into a fever pitch. He thrashed on the cot, a danger to himself and everyone else, his growls a litany of pure pain. As Selene approached, a flicker of lucidity, of the man still fighting inside, broke through the crimson haze. "Selene, stay back!" he gritted out, the words mangled and raw. "I'll hurt you." It was his final act of protection, trying to save her from himself even as he lay dying. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back, her resolve hardening. "You fought the beast in the woods to keep me safe. You held back in the duel to protect your pack. You have fought alone for long enough, Kael." She reached him, ignoring the dangerous proximity of his snapping jaws. "Now let me fight for you!" She placed her hands on his fevered brow. A jolt, pure and electric, shot through both of them. The beast within him roared and recoiled from her touch, but the agony of the poison was too strong. It was a stalemate. She looked at the pack's healer, a grim-faced old wolf. "You need to get the silver out. Now. I will hold the beast at bay. Do it." The healer nodded, understanding the desperate gamble. The final battle was not in the dueling ring, but here, in this room. A battle against poison, against silver, and against the demon in his blood. Chapter 21. To stand beside a king. The healer worked with frantic precision, his hands delving into the grievous wound as Selene became Kael's living anchor. She poured every ounce of her will, of the strange, calming power in her lichen blood, into the bond between them. It was a silent war fought in the space between souls. She felt the beast's rage, its pain, its terror, and she met it not with force, but with an unyielding calm, a quiet whisper in the heart of the hurricane that said, "I am here. You are not alone." The silver dagger was finally pulled free with a sickening sound, but the poison remained, a fire in his veins. For hours, Selene stayed with him, her hands never leaving his skin, her strength the only thing keeping his heart beating. Slowly, miraculously, the tide began to turn. The violent crimson in his aura began to recede, soothed by her touch. His thrashing ceased, the guttural snarls softening into pained groans. By the time the first rays of dawn pierced the high window of the den, he was still. He was breathing. He was Kael again. Exhausted and weak, Selene finally collapsed into a chair beside him, her own energy utterly spent. Later that day, a commotion outside the den roused her. Damon, his patience gone, was trying to force his way in, declaring the pack leaderless and his claim absolute. He was met by a wall of Kael's loyal warriors. The pack was on the brink of civil war. Just as blades were being drawn, the heavy door to the healing den creaked open. Kael stood there, leaning heavily on the doorframe, his side bandaged, his face pale and drawn. But his golden eyes were clear. He was alive. A collective gasp swept through the crowd, but he was clearly in no shape to fight. Damon's face split into a cruel, confident grin. Still alive? No matter. You can barely stand. The pack is mine by right. He took a step forward, but stopped as another figure appeared in the doorway. Selene emerged from the shadows of the den to stand beside Kael. She did not lean on him or hide behind him. She stood as his equal, her chin high, her eyes radiating a quiet, unshakable power that no one had ever seen in her before. She slipped her hand into Kael's, their fingers lacing together, and faced the crowd as one. Her presence beside him was not that of a consort. It was a declaration. They were two parts of a whole, an alpha of shadow and a luna of light, and their combined strength was a palpable force. The sight of them together, battered but unbroken, shifted the very atmosphere. The wavering loyalty of the pack solidified, their gazes turning from their wounded alpha to their defiant luna and back again. They were not looking at a defeated leader and his mate. They were looking at their king and queen, ready to face the final battle for their home. The climax was no longer just about Kael's survival. It was about their reign. Chapter 22. The Sword and the Anchor. The cold mountain air crackled with a tension thicker than any pre-storm cloud. Damon stood at the edge of the healing den, his face twisted with disbelief and rising fury. He had come to claim a crippled pack, and instead, he found an alpha reborn and a luna who radiated a power that defied all expectations. The Shadowclaw warriors, emboldened by their leader's unwavering front, snarled, their fangs bared, ready to protect their own. "You still stand, Kael, a walking corpse," Damon roared, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and desperation. "But you cannot fight. The curse has taken its toll. And you," he spat, turning his venomous gaze to Selene, "are a fool to stand by a dying beast." Kael, though pale, squeezed Selene's hand. His voice, though weaker than usual, carried the weight of ages. "My curse," he stated, his eyes sweeping over his pack, then landing on Damon, "is a part of me, a battle I fight, but my Luna, she is my victory." The declaration, so raw and public, was a final blow to Damon's authority. Enraged and humiliated, he let out a guttural scream and charged, aiming to finish the weakened Kael once and for all. Kael moved to meet him, his warrior instincts taking over, but the sudden exertion was too much. The curse, which Selene's presence held in a fragile truce, surged. Kael's golden eyes flared with a terrifying crimson light, a beastly snarl ripping from his throat as his control fractured. He was losing himself. But before the rage could take him, Selene moved. She did not scream or pull him back. She stepped forward with him into the heart of the conflict, placing her free hand on the center of his back. A visible ripple of white-hot, calming energy flowed from her into him. The red in his eyes did not vanish, but it was banked, controlled, honed by her presence into a focused weapon. He was the sword, and she was the hand that wielded it. Together, they were a single, unstoppable force. Kael's strike, now empowered by both the curse's strength and his own clarity, was brutally decisive. He disarmed Damon with a shattering blow and brought him to his knees, his forearm pressed against the rival alpha's throat. The fight was over. Silence fell, absolute and profound. Then, one by one, the warriors of the Shadowclaw pack and then, reluctantly, Damon's own, knelt. They did not just bow to their alpha. They bowed to their alpha and his Luna. Chapter 23. Severing the Last Ghost. In the aftermath, as Damon was dragged away in disgrace, Selene's eyes found Liam cowering in the crowd. She walked toward him, the pack parting before her as if she were the sea itself. He couldn't meet her gaze, his face a mask of shame and terror as she came to a stop before him. I'm sorry, Selene, he stammered, his words pathetic in the heavy silence. He forced me. I had no choice. You always have a choice, Liam, she said, her voice devoid of the anger he expected. It was worse. It was indifferent. He offered you something you wanted. You were never sorry for ignoring me. You were only sorry I became someone you couldn't ignore. She turned her back on him, leaving him to the justice of the pack. In that single, simple act, she severed the final tie to the insecure girl she had once been. The ghost of the girl who craved his validation, who measured her worth by his attention, had no more power over her. She was free. Kael, now standing tall on his own, addressed his pack. For years, I have hidden the devil in my blood, he admitted, his voice resonating with a newfound acceptance. I saw it as a weakness, a shame that I had to carry alone. I was wrong. His gaze found Selene, and the entire pack followed his line of sight. My curse is a raging fire, but my Luna, she is the calming sea. I am not strong in spite of my darkness. We are strong because we have found our balance. He openly acknowledged his curse, not as a flaw, but as a part of a whole, robbing his enemies of their greatest weapon against him forever. Chapter 24. A Luna by Choice. Later, as the keep settled into a weary peace, Kael and Selene stood alone in the quiet of his study. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls, but for the first time, there were no shadows between them. He turned to her, his golden eyes filled with an emotion that went far beyond gratitude or fated duty. The bond chose you, Selene. That is the magic of the goddess. But I chose you first. In that great hall, I saw you hiding, trying to become invisible, and I saw the strongest person in the room. You endured their cruelty with a strength they could never understand. You were a queen long before you ever wore a crown. He gently touched the mark on her neck, the symbol that had begun as a brand of possession but had become a symbol of their unity. I love you, not because the moon decreed it, but because you are the anchor for my soul, the woman who saw my monster and was not afraid. He took a breath, his next words holding more weight than any alpha command. Will you be my Luna? Not by my claim, not by fate, but by your own choice. Tears welled in Selene's eyes, but they were not tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of homecoming. The core question of her life, the incessant, cruel whisper that had told her she was unworthy, was finally, blessedly silent. She looked at this fierce, broken, magnificent man who had seen her when no one else had, and she knew she was more than enough. She was everything. Yes, she whispered, her voice full of a strength she finally recognized as her own. He pulled her into his arms, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was not about fate or destiny, but about two souls who had fought through their own private hells to find heaven in each other. It was a claiming, not of a prize, but of a partner, a promise of a bond that was dark, tender, and utterly unshakable.